We're going to have our first session of today on poverty and attention. And just as a quick reminder to everybody, we will have about 2 or 3 minutes at the end of each talk for you to ask any clarification questions about that talk or other kinds of questions. Then we will have a longer discussion session at the end of each panel. There'll be 15 minutes of discussion at the end. So if you would like to ask a question, please use the raise hand feature, or you can put your question into the chat box. Okay, and so with that, I would like to welcome Christina Brown to talk to us about cognitive endurance as human capital. And I think Christina is maybe still coming back, so she should be with us in just a moment.
Should we flip order maybe?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Okay, so in that case, Ethan, are you possibly ready to go instead?
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay, wonderful. So we'll have Ethan Young presenting to us on can ecologically relevant stimuli improve task performance for people living in poverty. Thanks, Ethan.
Sure. Okay, so can everyone see the screen? Okay. Okay, thanks everyone. My name's Ethan. I'm currently a postdoc at Utrecht University, and today I'll be talking to you about some work that myself and my colleagues, Willem Frankenhaus and Bruce Ellis, have been working on for the past few years. Again, can ecologically relevant stimuli improve task performance for people living in adversity or poverty? So typically when we think about cognition in harsh environments or cognitive abilities among people living in poverty, we invoke the deficit model. And the deficit model sort of suggests that exposure to adversity, exposure to poverty, exposure to things, adverse experiences in general sort of undermine development. And so the central insight from the deficit model is typically that adversity should impair cognitive abilities. In contrast, there's been sort of growing interest in an alternative model or complementary model called the hidden talents approach. And the hidden talents approach suggests that although adversity absolutely has sort of very harmful effects on cognition and a broad suite of things, there should be more nuanced patterns to this. So while adversity might impair one type of cognitive ability or one type of domain of cognition, it might also enhance others. So what do we mean? So the central insight from the hidden talents approach is that people should develop abilities that are ecologically relevant to their lived experiences. And this suggests that there shouldn't be this unitary sort of harmful effect of adversity. There might actually be abilities that we can measure that are actually useful to people's lives, especially to the specific context that they live in. So past research that sort of looked at this has focused on executive functions, and particularly sort of executive functions that have to do with like regulating attention and looking at working memory. And specifically, they focused on environmental unpredictability. And the logic was that looking at the kind of challenges people face when living in a chaotic environment or an environment that changes frequently or unexpectedly, what kinds of abilities might be useful there? And so when looking at attention, we sort of thought about, well, two key abilities within the attention domain are the ability to inhibit impulses, delay gratification, et cetera, and shifting, basically being able to switch between tasks quickly and being able to sort of incur a low reaction time cost to changing environments. And so we thought perhaps adversity, particularly unpredictability, might have a negative effect on inhibition, but maybe a positive effect on shifting. And similarly, with working memory, we also contrasted these two components of working memory, updating versus retrieval, with similar logic, suggesting that maybe adversity unpredictability might enhance updating because it involves tracking the environment and being focused on what's currently relevant, versus retrieval, which is being able to recall past events, relate them to now, and adversity, particularly unpredictability, might not enhance retrieval, especially if information changes or if the relevance of past information is no longer there. So that's exactly what we find. We find that environmental unpredictability impairs inhibition, retrieval, but enhances shifting and updating. Now, importantly, we have found this only when we experimentally manipulated the current context to be economically uncertain. So using sort of a slideshow priming manipulation, we can experimentally find these effects, suggesting that sort of mild stressors about economics, kind of economic uncertainty, might activate these abilities. So what do these tasks look like? Well, in a typical attention shifting task, you see sort of a screen like this. You have a rule to follow that's either categorize this shape as according to its color or shape. And so in this trial, you would say, okay, this is a blue triangle, so I'm going to categorize it as blue. And then you might see another trial that has a rule again, color. You would categorize this yellow circle as yellow, but occasionally there'll be a switch trial, and now the rule changes from color to shape, and you have to now think about a different dimension of the object. Now it's the shape, so you would categorize it as a triangle, and so on and so forth. And so here the key outcome is how well, how quickly can you respond on switch trials relative to repeat trials, and this is called the switch cost. And so small switch costs indicate good, efficient switching. In working memory updating tasks, we typically see that we measure it using a task where you see a sequence of shapes, 3 different shapes, triangles, circles, or squares, and your job is to track how many of each you see. So you might see a square, okay, 1 square in the sequence, you see a triangle, okay, now 1 square, 1 triangle, now all 3, you've seen circle, triangle, square, and then when you see a new object, you have to update your count. Now there's 2 triangles, and at the end of the sequence, you have to report correctly how many of each you've seen. If you're good at updating, your portion correct should be high. You should be able to track each of these running counts well. So returning to our question, one issue with this previous research is that the applied value is a little bit hard to see. Do you really want to suggest to teachers, to educators, that in order to get people who live in harsh contexts, that you have to stress them out to get them to perform better? That seems to have limited applied value. So we wanted to know, well, what if we work within the task stimuli? What if we change what people are applying their abilities? What kinds of things they're thinking about? And so if we replace those with ecologically relevant stimuli, would that have an effect? So in the current study, what we did was we collected roughly 600 adolescent participants in Salt Lake City who were exposed to a broad range of socioeconomic conditions. We wanted to look at multiple dimensions of adversity. So in poverty, it's a large bucket construct, right? There's many different things that people experience within an impoverished context. So, we wanted to understand how is different dimensions of adversity within that affect performance. So we looked at, again, environmental unpredictability, exposure to violence, and socioeconomic status. And we wanted to compare performance on these tasks, again, using the abstract versions, but compare them within subjects to versions that used ecologically relevant content. And to analyze these data, we used a multiverse analysis approach, which I will briefly explain in a bit. So what do these ecologically relevant tasks look like? Well, instead of using shapes and colors, we simply replaced those shapes and colors with actual faces that were emoting either angry or happy expressions. And those rules from color to shape were now categorize the image according to emotion and gender. For working memory updating, we simply replaced the triangles, the circles, and squares with objects that people might see in their actual environment. So namely, $5 bill, angry face, and a Utah City bus. So all that's really changed here, task structures are exactly the same, but what's changed is that ecologically relevant content from the real world. So coming to multiverse analysis, I think this is a really exciting approach for especially messy data where you have to make many different data processing decisions. And so in brief, one thing that multiverse analysis kind of highlights is that there are two kind of data processing categories that we encounter. There are non-arbitrary decisions you can make with your data, and there are arbitrary decisions. Non-arbitrary decisions are decisions that you really need to process your data a certain way to make sure it has the right validity. However, arbitrary decisions are ones that reviewers often come up with to say, well, what if you exclude these outliers, or what if you use this alternative composite, or these are things that the data analyst is faced with where there are many equally defensible alternatives. Often people are kind of have to pick one and stick to it, and then we'll end up having to do many alternative analyses anyway down the line. Multiverse analysis says, let's think about all of those right now, lay them out, and do them all together. So for our current study, we had 6 different arbitrary decisions that we wanted to make with 2 alternatives each, which led to sort of a multiverse of possible data sets that are all equally defensible. A data analyst wouldn't look at them and say, yeah, that seems logical. Okay, so then what you do is you take your data sets, you perform the same analysis over all of them, and then you compile the results and look at them in the aggregate. Okay, so what do we find? For attention shifting, we were interested in the interaction between the task type, whether you use abstract or real world content, and the interaction with adversity. So we looked at unpredictability, violence, and socioeconomic status. One thing that's interesting about multiverse is it gives you a sense of the general robustness of your analysis. So when we look at the effects on the top panel, you see when you compare high and low adversity, so the white versus gray lines, you can see that there's basically no interaction here. The people are performing basically the same across the both conditions. However, there's sort of a strong main effect of the ecologically relevant condition that increased the switch costs, which suggests that actually the real world condition was actually harder for people in general, but there was no interaction. And that's sort of confirmed by the P curve below, which shows that across all 64 data sets, none of the P values for the interaction term ever fell below our alpha threshold. And this was true for violence and for SES. So same pattern across all 3. Now, for working memory updating, we found that for unpredictability, we again don't see much of an interaction pattern. And again, the P curve kind of confirms that. However, for violence, we find that there is an interaction under some analytical conditions, particularly 40% of the time you see an interaction. And what you see is that for the high adversity group, the people who were exposed to more violence, when they did the abstract version, their performance was much worse compared to their performance on the ecologically relevant condition, whereas people from low violence exposure backgrounds tended to perform about the same on both tests. And this was also true for socioeconomic status, suggesting that adversity, or at least for people exposed to different types of adversity, real world content seems to equalize performance. People are rising to meet their counterparts when the stimuli of the task are ecologically relevant. So again, returning to this question, can this ecologically relevant stimuli improve task performance? It seems like it doesn't really do much for attention shifting. However, it does seem to work for working memory updating, particularly for people exposed to violence and poverty, at least under certain analytic decisions. So what I'd like you guys to take away from this is that deficits are really only one piece of the puzzle. It's only one side of the story. People also develop adaptations to their environments, and these deserve to be investigated. In addition, both processes might operate simultaneously, right? So people can both exhibit deficits and strengths in one profile. We should be thinking about the whole person and all of their abilities. And this real world content, ecological relevance, might equalize performance for people from adversity, and this might be an interesting route for educational intervention. We could leverage this in different contexts. With respect to multiverse, I think this is an exciting technique that people can use to transparently and systematically unpack data, especially when working in the community. There's all kinds of things that go on. And for the data analyst to kind of reduce that cognitive load, multiverse analysis could be a good way to kind of present a nice, full, and transparent picture. And it could provide future research with guidelines for different kinds of data decisions that matter for your area of study. And there's some pretty cool paths that come along with it. So with that, I'd like to thank my funders and thank all of you for listening. I'm open for questions.
Okay, thank you, Ethan. So we have some time for some questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please do raise your hands or put it in the chat box. And perhaps while people are thinking of questions, I can just sort of ask you, Ethan.
Sure.
I'm curious. I think these are really cool findings, and you mentioned at the very end, the possibility implications for educational interventions. So I was sort of curious because if sort of the argument is that people are adapting to their environment, maybe children are adapting to their environment early in life. In what way might their strengths be mismatched to the sort of educational context that they end up entering into, and how can you see your work as informing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are many interpretations for how why these interactions might have emerged. One possibility is that the ecologically relevant content, really is relevant to people's lives, and it's sort of allowing people to access their potential. And current educational contexts kind of use these symbolic way of teaching with symbols and math and equations or kind of things that are devoid of meaning. And that might make it difficult for people to access their potential. An alternative way of thinking is that that style of education is actually specific to high socioeconomic backgrounds, right? So that is culturally relevant to particular groups, but it's not as relevant to people who come from poverty or adverse conditions. So you can think of the stimuli as both giving advantages or being mismatched or whatever, and exactly how that plays out. I don't know that our data can answer that per se. We're not sure, but it's certainly interesting, and educators can think about, what's the meaning behind this lesson or this task that I want to teach? Can we match the content to activate people's motivations? I think that's a relevant question for teachers to ask themselves and educators.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? Oh, I think I see a hands up. Okay. Timothy, if you'd like to ask your question, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ethan. You mentioned specifically about the importance of updating as far as decision-making and any type of environmental uncertainty. And it seems like that would be very much equalized for people in poverty, because both people who have affluence and poverty would both be facing a certain type of uncertainty within their environment. So will you please expand on your concept as far as updating and what that would look like for people in different socioeconomic environments?
Sure, yeah. Working memory updating is a pretty interesting construct. It's measured in multiple different ways. In the context of kind of thinking conceptually or theoretically about it, the way I think about it is that updating is all about sort of remaining present oriented and focusing on what's relevant now, and a little bit about forgetting past conditions so that you can focus on the present. And so sort of the original logic behind some of the work I reviewed before I talked about the actual findings is that that's actually really critical in unpredictable environments, because information is changing. You can imagine that if you're trying to understand sort of the patterns and things that happen in your environment, maybe what people do or say, if those change from day to day and you're sort of holding on to past representations of that and aren't updating your views or are not staying present focused, you could pay a cost basically not optimizing your behavior. And if you sort of forget sort of past patterns, then you can stay focused on what's happening now and sort of fluidly adapt. And in a predictable environment, that's certainly helpful, but it's also helpful to kind of keep a long-running tally about things, because your past experiences are relevant. They continue to be relevant. People behave the same ways. You can expect the same things. So there's sort of a tension between keeping information for a long time versus staying present oriented. And that seems to, the updating test that I use seems to highlight that difference for people from different backgrounds.
Thank you for the clarification, Ethan.
And there's one more question here from Fernanda Pacheco in the chat, and they say, do you think there's a possibility for this type of study to be translated to broader populations in poor countries who are historically exposed to crisis conditions and generational trauma?
Absolutely. I think there's actually already a rich literature in sort of anthropology and cultural psychology that has sort of compared across cultures, not individual differences in adversity exposures, but comparing cultures, that when you translate, for example, learning about probabilities, you translate those from like sort of math notation to like naturalistic frequencies, that people actually do quite well in different environments, especially hunter-gatherer societies where you're assumed they get no formal education. If you simply change the content domain or the way the tests are administered, but are keeping the actual concept that's being taught the same, people respond and actually perform equally as well. So I think there's lots of scope for doing this broadly, and we can draw on that literature and on some of the ideas behind the hidden talents approach.
Awesome. Thank you, Ethan. All right, so I'd like to invite our next speaker, Christina Brown.